So in the main white gallery we've got work by Cian Dayrit, who is from the Philippines, and he's responding to the situation there, living in a country in the global south that really suffers from a lot of human rights violations.
In the Accursed Share, I'm presenting some textile works, some sculptures and installations, which are all done in collaboration with different groups. A lot of my work speak about ideas of power and space, and how these are pretty much reproduced by objects and institutions. My work is a lot of collaboration with different groups and communities and individuals, and then we talk about the conditions of the Philippines. A lot of the work take the form of maps and artifacts and shrines, which then respond to how people navigate through their everyday lives based on their conditions politically, culturally, economically. Much of my work attempts to visualize and document the historical and structural aspects of my context and how it is either underdeveloped or overexploited, and try to relate these narratives into the experiences of the people today.
Opposite Cian's work, we've got work by Sami Beloge, an artist who's based in Belgium but is from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, a country that was formerly colonized by Belgium. What we see in his work are 50 copper gun casings. These are from the First and Second World Wars, and they would have been fired and then adorned by soldiers in the trenches. But what Sami's trying to tell us here is this long and ongoing story of colonization where minerals are extracted from the grounds to feed and enrich wealthy nations, and then they become munitions for those same nations to blow each other apart, and then wind up as trinkets in middle-class households. The soundtrack to this work is the sound of an African choir recorded in the 1940s. And in previous works, Sami has shown photographs of this choir being made to hold copper crosses in front of their hearts. And he says there's no clearer indication of how missionaries tried to steal their souls while also exploiting the riches of the land. We're then showing work by Moira Davey, who's a Canadian photographer and writer and intellectual and filmmaker as well. And we're showing her work that she started in 1990, a series of works called Copperheads. This is a very close-up macro lens shot of the Lincoln penny. So a penny that's been in circulation from 1909 and has kind of witnessed, if you like, a whole century of economic changes and globalization. What we see is the Lincoln face on the penny and how distorted and warped that's been by the circulation of these coins, which at certain times, like during recessions, would have been worth almost nothing. And I think Moira is really interested in that projection of value, in the baseness of some of these materials, but then the attempt to impose upon them this kind of godlike figurehead of the state.
In my practice, I reproduce transformations and repairs from public space through weaving. So I'm interested in these kind of makeshift moments where tape, plastic, cardboard, common everyday materials are used to hold things temporarily together while they're transitioning. Because I'm interested in how these repairs show us how urban space is transforming, but at the same time they're also gestures of individuals taking care of their inhabited environment. I come from photography, so I was I guess looking for another way to deal with reproduction. I learned how to weave, which is actually an ancestral knowledge. My maternal great-grandmother was a weaver, and weaving allowed me to kind of postpone or stretch out the making of the image, so to speak. And weaving also is a way to kind of make work that is situated and that my kind of body is more involved in the process. So yeah, this kind of stretched out time, slow time of weaving also allows me to understand the transformations that I'm looking at, why they're there, how were they made, and what do they mean.
We're also showing work by Mawar Arsanias. It's part of her series called Who is Afraid of Ideology, which looks at the ways that different women try to reconnect to the land, whether they're eco-feminist or autonomous women's groups trying to relearn how to grow plants and seedlings for both food and medicine. In part 4 of this series, called Reverse Shot, She looks at a particular area in Lebanon and asks the question of how that area could be turned back into a commons land. So an area owned by a community that can be there to provide and sustain that community. What we learn through this film is that trying to resuscitate a commons land is not just a legal or geographical process, but it's actually about trying to bring the soil under our feet back to life as well. Because unless the soil has been nurtured and cared for by different generations of people, it loses its ability to sustain life. So this is also about ancestors and the debt that we owe to them to be in a living environment. We also have work by Goldin and Seneby, who are based in Stockholm. And these are artists who are really brilliant storytellers. They bring in complexity and nuances into all of the artworks that they make. For the artwork with us, it's based on a plot of land. And it seems natural that they would be interested in the dual meaning of a plot as both an area but also a narrative that intrigues you. They bought a plot of land in Belgium and found out it was on top of a disused coal mine. And they really wanted to dig deep to find out what the land could reveal to them. And through the rocks and coal formations, they found a series of fossils. And these fossils describe to them a carboniferous forest, so a forest that existed 350 million years ago. They show us an artist's studio taken outside in the space, really pushing that idea of on plein air painting, where artists would go out of the studio and get their hands dirty in order to represent nature. And inside that, there's a beautiful poem by Mustafa Kaur, who's the Belgian poet laureate. It's called Utopian Flowers, and it gives us the sense that people that were going into these mines, as the poet's father did, were really encountering this deep time, this ancestral matter under our feet.
TerraZero is a collective of artists, theorists and technologists. In the society we live in today, we have a lot of systems already which govern like nature, which govern certain like ecological systems, which govern forests. And at TerraZero we try to figure out if there are different ways of doing this, if this could be done by like programs, if this could be done by really democratic decisions, and what the interfaces between these various variants could be. At TerraZero we look a lot into smart contracts and into blockchain technology, specifically because the agency which is given to the forest can be amplified through smart contracts, which essentially like can be owned by no one. So you have these programs which could administer capital in a really almost like autonomous way.
Hannah Gonvola is a German artist based in New York, and she's often made works where she paints on top of defunct forms of currency, so banknotes that are no longer in circulation. For the Migration series, she paints birds on top of the banknotes, and it creates this really interesting dialogue between the notes themselves, which are often trying to describe the aspirations of a civilization, its ideas about philosophy and language and heritage and the powerful buildings that it commands, and then the fragility of nature with these beautiful small European birds painted on top of them. We were delighted when Hannah agreed to make a new work just for the Accursed Share. So she painted a grey wagtail, a bird often found in Scotland, on top of a defunct Scottish note. Apparently during the time of the Highland clearances, a sort of contested period in Scottish history, if you saw a grey wagtail between yourself and your house, it was a sign of imminent eviction, which seemed like a perfect story for the Accursed Share. The back of this note shows a tall ship mysteriously heading out over the seas as well. So it evokes ideas of emigration, of movement, but also the links that Scotland has to things like the slave trade, which again is very relevant to the Accursed Share. We're also delighted to be showing the work of Lubena Himid. Lubena is a national treasure, and Naming the Money from 2004 is a seminal artwork. This was made in response to European history paintings, which often feature black people as slaves or servants around the European courts. These are people who've been deprived even such a fundamental thing as their name. And this is an artwork that's about trying to restore that individuality back to these people. The work features a soundtrack that includes the artist's voice, reading out the individual names of these characters, and these beautiful, almost haiku-like statements that give you a sense of what their skills are, what their aspirations are, where they've come from and where they're going. And with the music around the space, it's obvious that Lulu Boehner is wanting to sort of frame this history, not as a history of trauma, but one of survival and vibrancy. It's also an artwork that she's connecting to not just long histories, but also current politics, such as the issues around migration and the way that migrants are often made anonymous too. So throughout the Accursed Share and all these artists' works, we build up a bigger picture of monetary debt, the system that we live with and have normalized so much that we forget that the coins in our pockets and the faces that are upon them represent centuries of colonization, of land grabbing, of eviction, of plantations, of the world around us being exploited for profit. And what this exhibition does is it brings that back alive, it makes it embodied, and it presents us with the consequences of this really accursed system.